Nobody noticed what was happening inside the small cabin near Bitterroot Creek. From the outside, it looked like every other homestead in the Montana Territory. Weathered pine logs, a stone chimney releasing thin smoke, a woodshed leaning against the north wall. Nothing about it suggested that something unusual was taking shape beneath the floorboards. Nothing suggested that a woman inside was quietly making a decision that would change how an entire settlement understood what it meant to survive winter. But that is where the story begins, not with the storm, not with the cold. It begins with a woman sitting alone at 10 o'clock at night, mending socks by lamplight, reaching down to pick up a spool of thread that had rolled off the table. Her hand touched the floor, and the floor was cold as stone. She stayed there for a moment, palm flat against the wood planks, not moving. The fire in the hearth was burning well. She could feel the heat of it against her left side. The room should have been warm. The fire was doing its job. But the floor beneath her hand felt like she had pressed it against the surface of a frozen creek. She sat back in her chair and looked at the hearth. Then she looked at the floor. Then she sat quietly and began to think. She had been looking in the wrong direction for weeks. The fire was not the enemy. The cold rising from below was. Her name was Sarah Whitmore. She was 32 years old. She had been a widow since April. Her husband Owen had died on a Tuesday morning in spring. The kind of ordinary Tuesday that gives no warning of what it intends to take from you. He was a timber cutter. A falling tree had come down in the wrong direction, and by noon 2 men were standing at her door holding Owen's hat in their hands. There was no final conversation, no goodbye, just the hat and the sound of her own breathing in the silence after the men left. People in the settlement expected her to fall apart. She did not, at least not in any way they could see. That evening she cooked dinner. She bathed her youngest. She read to her daughter by candlelight, the same as any other night. It was only after both children were asleep that she walked out onto the porch in the darkness, sat down on the wooden step, and cried until there was nothing left, until she was completely empty. Then she went back inside, put a kettle on, and started calculating. How much money in the clay jar on the shelf? How much debt at Finch's store? How much firewood in the shed? And how many weeks of winter remained? That was Sarah Whitmore. She cried in the dark and calculated in the light. Her daughter Emma was 8 years old and far more observant than most adults gave her credit for. The girl had a habit of pretending to be asleep while actually watching everything around her with quiet, careful eyes. Sarah had caught her doing it more than once. Emma did not ask many questions. She watched and she waited, and she filed things away inside herself like someone who understood that information was valuable. Her son Daniel was 5. His fingers were always colder than they should have been, always slightly purplish at the tips even indoors, as if his body struggled to push warmth all the way to the ends of his hands. The coughing had started in mid-October. A dry rattling sound that came in the night, waking him and then fading, leaving him breathless and confused in the dark. He did not know he was sick. He only knew that he was tired more than usual and that nighttime had become something uncertain and uncomfortable. The cabin itself was solid by the standards of the territory. 14 feet wide and 18 feet long, pine logs packed tight with chinking a river stone fireplace that drew well enough. The floor sat 6 inches above the ground on cider posts, standard construction for the region. Decent insulation in the walls, a good roof. On paper, it was livable. In practice, by November of 1887, it was slowly failing Sarah and her children. She had tried everything the neighbors suggested. She packed straw beneath the floorboards, but the wind that ran underneath the cabin at night simply scattered them. She hung canvas around the foundation to block the draft, but the canvas froze stiff within days and seemed to draw cold to it rather than repel it. She burned more firewood, rationing other things to afford it, and watched a third of her winter's supply disappear in 2 weeks without any meaningful improvement in the temperature near the floor where her children slept. She stuffed rags into every gap she could find in the lower walls. That helped a little, not enough. Here is what she came to understand through those weeks of failed attempts, not from any book or instruction, but from paying close attention to her own home every morning and every evening. She pressed her palm to the floor and then to the wall and compared what she felt. The walls were warmer, always. Even the outer walls, which faced the cold Montana wind directly, were warmer than the floor beneath her feet. The reason was the space below the cabin. That 6-inch gap between the floor planks and the ground had become a wind channel. Every night, air moved through it freely, carrying the cold of the open Montana winter directly against the underside of the floor. The fire above warmed the air in the room, but the cold from below stayed. It lived in the wood of the floor, pulling warmth out of the room from underneath faster than the fire could replace it. She was heating the air while the ground consumed the heat. It was a battle she could not win from above. By the second week of November, she looked at her wood pile and then at the almanac hanging on the wall. 14 weeks of winter left at minimum. The math did not work. Even burning carefully, she would run out before March. That was the night she sat in her chair and felt for the first time something close to despair. Not despair about the cold itself, something more specific and more frightening. She had tried everything reasonable. She had tried everything her neighbors could suggest, and none of it was enough. The cold was winning quietly and patiently, the way cold always wins in the end, by simply outlasting everything you put against it. She sat with that feeling for a while. Reverend Crawford had offered his church as shelter. He had said it gently without condescension, that the building was large and warm, and she and the children were welcome through the winter if the cabin proved too difficult. It was not a cruel offer. It was a reasonable one. She found herself actually considering it that night for the first time. Then Daniel coughed. One short burst from behind the curtain that divided the children's sleeping area from the main room, then silence. He did not wake, but the sound of it moved through Sarah like something physical. She stood up. She was not going to the church. She was not going to spend the winter as a burden in someone else's space while her cabin sat empty and her independence dissolved quietly into charity. That was not despair talking. That was clarity. She stood in the middle of the room and thought about her father. He had been a builder in Ohio, a practical man who taught her to read architectural drawings before she was 10, who brought her to job sites and explained foundations and drainage and load-bearing walls without ever suggesting that the information was somehow less appropriate for her than for a son. She had absorbed all of it. She had simply never needed to use it until now. One afternoon when she was 12, they were digging footings for a new house foundation. She had asked him why they had to go so deep when the frost line was only 2 feet down. He had leaned on his shovel and looked at her thoughtfully before answering. "Go down 5 feet," he said, "and the earth stops changing. Down there, it stays the same temperature all year. It doesn't freeze, it doesn't boil, it just stays. That's the most stable place on earth, right under your feet." She had nodded and gone back to digging without fully understanding why that mattered. She was 12. She filed it away the way Emma filed things away. And then for 20 years, she did not think about it again. She thought about it now. She crossed the room to the corner where the tools hung on the wall. She took down the iron pry bar. She crouched in the northwest corner of the cabin, directly beneath where Daniel and Emma slept, and she worked the flat end of the bar into the gap between 2 floor planks. She stopped before she pulled. She thought about it one more time. The risk, a grown woman alone digging under her own home. No one to help if something went wrong. Children sleeping 6 feet away. a structure that could be destabilized by careless excavation. Jacob Holt had told her once that you could collapse a cabin by undermining its foundation supports. He had not said it to her specifically. She had overheard him say it to another man at the mill 2 summers ago, but she remembered it. She weighed that risk against the other one. The risk of doing nothing. Doing nothing had a guaranteed outcome. She already knew what it looked like. She had been watching it for weeks. She pulled up the plank. Beneath it was darkness. She held her lamp down into the gap. Earth, hard-packed dark brown, frozen at the surface into something almost crystalline. She took the pry bar and drove it into the ground. It hit with a solid crack and barely penetrated. She drove it again. This time the surface cracked, and below the frozen crust, the bar sank 3 inches into something softer. She reached her hand into the hole. The earth below the frost line was warmer than the air above it. Not warm the way a room is warm, but warmer, measurably, unmistakably warmer. She held her palm against the exposed soil and felt it against her skin, and thought he was right. He was completely right. There it is, she said quietly to no one. She began to plan. She did not have paper to spare, so she worked through the dimensions in her head. 8 feet long, 6 feet wide. Just tall enough to sit upright in. Walls lined with river stone to prevent collapse and hold warmth. A narrow ladder for access. A small ventilation pipe angled up through the foundation. A trapdoor fitted flush with the floor planks above, hidden under a woven rug. The excavated soil was the problem. She could not pile it anywhere obvious. She settled on carrying it out in a canvas sack and spreading it thin across the garden plot beside the cabin each morning, working in the early dark before anyone was moving on the road. She went back to bed at 2 in the morning. She did not sleep. She began digging before dawn. The first morning she worked for 90 minutes before the children woke. The frozen surface crust was the hardest part. Once through it, the earth came up in dark, heavy clumps that smelled of pine roots and mineral water. She filled the canvas sack, carried it outside in the gray pre-dawn, spread it thin across the garden, went back inside, started breakfast. Emma came out from behind the curtain and watched her mother at the stove. "You're up early," Emma said. "Couldn't sleep. Come eat." Emma looked at her mother's hands. There was soil under her fingernails. She looked at the floor in the northwest corner where the rug was slightly displaced. Then she looked at her mother again. She did not say anything. She sat down and ate her cornmeal. That was the thing about Emma. She saw everything and said almost nothing until she was ready. On the 4th day, a woman named Margaret Briggs appeared at the door with a jar of preserved apples and no warning. Margaret was 38, practical in the way that frontier women who survive tend to be practical, not warm exactly, but reliable in a way that meant more than warmth. She was not a close friend. She was a neighbor, the kind you knew would show up with what was needed and no excess sentiment attached to it. "I hear you're digging under the cabin," she said when Sarah opened the door. Sarah looked at her for a moment. "News travels." "It does. Can I come in?" Sarah stepped back. Margaret entered, looked around with the efficient assessment of someone who misses nothing, set the jar on the table and turned. "Do you need help?" she asked. "I don't need someone to dig. I need someone who won't ask questions about what I'm doing or why." Margaret considered this for about 3 seconds. "I can watch the children in the mornings. Thomas doesn't need to know." She said it plainly without drama. Thomas was her husband. He would not approve, and she knew it, and she had already decided that his approval was not the relevant factor. Before she turned to leave, Margaret paused at the door. "Owen Whitmore was a good man," she said quietly. "He would be satisfied watching what you're doing." She left without waiting for a response. Sarah stood in the middle of the room after the door closed, not moving for a long time. No one had spoken Owen's name to her since the funeral without a note of pity in their voice. Margaret had said it differently. like he was somewhere nearby watching with approval, like what Sarah was doing would make sense to him. She stood there and let herself feel that for a moment. Then she went back to work. It was on the third day of Margaret watching the children that Sarah encountered Horace Finch at the general store. Horace was 45, a careful man, in the way that people who keep accounts of other people's debts tend to become careful. He had lived at Bitterroot Creek for 15 years and considered himself something of a steward of the community's well-being, which in practice meant that he monitored the financial and social circumstances of his neighbors with an attention to detail that he believed was concern and others sometimes experienced as surveillance. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had decided that there was a correct order to things and that maintaining that order was a form of kindness. When Sarah set her lamp oil and candles on the counter, Horace looked at his ledger, then looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began in the tone of someone preparing to say something uncomfortable for the listener's own good. "Your account stands at $14. Winter is long. It might be worth considering Reverend Crawford's offer. He has the space and it would be warmer for the children than—" Sarah counted the exact coins for the lamp oil and candles onto the counter. "Not a cent over." "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she said. She picked up her purchases and walked to the door. Horace watched her go. Standing near the far end of the counter was a large, quiet man named Jacob Holt, the settlement's carpenter who had come in for a box of nails. He had heard the entire exchange. He said nothing. He watched Sarah push through the door into the cold and disappear from view. Then he looked at Horace and said nothing about that either. He paid for his nails and left. But on the road back to his workshop, he passed Sarah's cabin. He looked at it without stopping. He was a carpenter. He looked at structures the way other people looked at faces reading what was underneath. He looked at the cedar posts holding the floor 6 inches off the ground and felt the familiar small discomfort of a man who has just heard something dismissed that he is not entirely certain can be dismissed. He walked on. 3 days later, Jacob was passing the cabin again in the early morning when he saw Sarah in the garden pouring dark soil from a canvas sack onto the frozen ground and spreading it with her boot. He stopped. "Mrs. Whitmore." She looked up. He looked at the soil, dark brown dents clearly excavated from depth rather than scraped from the surface. "You're digging beneath the cabin." "I'm improving the foundation." "Mrs. Whitmore." He lowered his voice not unkindly but with the careful patience of a man trying to reach someone he believes is making a mistake. "I've built 3 cabins in this valley. Dig incorrectly under load-bearing supports and the floor will drop. You have 2 young children." "I am aware that I have 2 young children," Sarah said. "Then you understand why." "That is precisely why I'm doing this, Mr. Holt." She picked up the empty canvas sack and walked back to the cabin door. Jacob stood on the road watching the door close behind her. He stood there for a moment longer than he intended to. His eyes moved across the structure of the cabin, the posts, the floor level, the gap between the wood and the earth. He thought about what she would have to do to make it work without destabilizing the supports. He thought about whether it was possible to do it correctly. He thought for just a moment about what it would mean if she was right. Then he shook his head and went to work. What Jacob did not know and could not have known from the road was that Sarah had already made the structural calculations he was worried about. She had mapped the positions of every cedar support post and designed her excavation to leave a clear margin around each one. She had thought about wall collapse and was already planning the river stone lining that would hold the earthen walls in place. She had thought about what her father would have done differently, and in most cases she was doing what he would have done. What she had not planned for was the east wall of the excavation. On the 14th night of digging, she was working alone in the space that was now almost 4 feet deep, shaping the eastern wall into a flat vertical surface. The lamp was burning steadily on the small shelf she had cut into the north wall for the purpose. She was working methodically, cutting into the earth with the narrow spade pulling loose soil back toward her. The eastern wall moved, not dramatically, not all at once. A section near the top where the frozen crust gave way to looser subsurface soil simply leaned inward, and then a larger section followed, and the lamp went over, and the darkness was complete. She did not panic. This was important. She sat very still in the total darkness and let herself breathe slowly while she figured out what had happened and what her situation was. Soil against her left shoulder, heavier than she expected. The ladder was behind her, but the direction of fallen earth had shifted it. She could feel the weight, but she was not pinned. She had room to move. She thought about Owen without meaning to. Not the grief of him, but the practical presence of him. He had been a deliberate man, slow to react in emergencies in a way that turned out to be exactly right, pausing to assess before acting. She had been frustrated by it sometimes when they were young. She understood it now. She put her hands on the earth around her and felt for the differences, where it was loose and where it was packed, where it gave and where it held. She found the direction of the firmest resistance, which was toward the north wall, where she had cut the shelf, and she began working her way toward it slowly and carefully in the dark. It took almost 20 minutes. When she came up through the trap door into the cabin above, Emma was sitting on the floor directly beside the opening, knees pulled to her chest, holding an unlit candle in both hands. Sarah looked at her daughter, 8 years old, sitting in the dark beside the hole her mother had disappeared into, waiting, holding a candle she had not lit because she had not wanted to leave the spot long enough to reach the fire. "I thought you might need light," Emma said. Sarah sat on the floor next to her daughter. She was covered in soil. Her hands were scraped. She was breathing harder than she would have liked to admit. She put her arm around Emma and held her, and the girl leaned into her without a word. And Sarah allowed herself, just for a moment in the darkness of the cabin, with her daughter pressed against her side, to feel how frightened she had actually been. Just for a moment. Then she straightened. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." "I wasn't going to leave," Emma said simply. Sarah looked at her daughter for a long time. Then she stood cross to the lamp, lit it, and sat down at the table with a scrap of paper she could not really afford to use. She drew the floor plan of the excavation from memory, marking every support post, every wall line, every measurement. Then she added something she had not included before. A second way out, small, barely large enough for a child, running at an angle from the northeast corner up through the base of the foundation wall to the exterior. Not for her. She was fairly certain she could always find her way out. The second passage was for Emma and Daniel if there was ever a night when she was not there to lead them. She drew it carefully, measuring twice with the pencil before committing the line to paper. Then she began redesigning the east wall. Tighter stone placement, smaller gaps, more overlap at the courses. She would also add a timber ledger at the top of the stone wall to hold the earth above it, back a detail her father had used in a root cellar they built together in Ohio when she was 15. She had not planned to use it here, but the earth had offered its opinion on the matter, and she had listened. She worked on the drawings until the lamp began to gutter low. Then she folded the paper and put it inside the tin box where she kept Owen's letters and the children's birth documents. She banked the fire, checked that both children were warm, and went to sleep. In the morning, she went back to digging. 3 weeks after she pulled up the first floorboard, she stepped down the narrow ladder and found she could stand upright in the space. The ceiling was earth and root above her head. The walls were dry, stacked riverstone fitted and wedged with pine bark, and dried needles packed into the gaps between the stone and the surrounding earth. The floor was pine boards laid over a thin bed of dry grass with a heavier cloth spread over everything. She stood in the room and held up her lamp. The flame did not move. There was no draft, no whisper of outside air. The silence down here was different from the silence in the cabin above. Heavier, older. The kind of quiet that had been in the earth long before anyone built anything on top of it. She pressed her palm against the stone wall the same way she pressed it against the floor of the cabin each night. The stone was cool, but not cold. She held her hand there and counted slowly to 30. The stone did not pull the warmth from her hand the way the cabin floor did. It simply held it, steady, even. She climbed back up, fitted the trap door into place, and pulled the rug over it. From above, nothing looked different. A rug on the floor, a corner of a room. She made dinner. She helped Daniel with the button on his coat that had been giving him trouble. She listened to Emma read aloud from the primer she was working through. She did not say anything about what was under the rug in the corner. She was not ready to say anything yet. She needed to know it worked before she asked her children to trust it. She would not ask them for faith she had not yet earned with evidence. Outside, the temperature that night dropped to 14 degrees below zero. Inside, near the fire, it barely reached 50. Under the rug through the trap door, 6 feet below the floor of the cabin, a candle Sarah had left burning on the small shelf recorded something different. She had left her small household thermometer hanging next to it. When she went down in the morning to check, the candle had burned about 3 hours before going out. The thermometer read 53 degrees, not warm, but warmer than the room above, warmer than the cabin had been in weeks. She stood in the underground room in the gray light coming through the ventilation pipe and read the number on the thermometer twice. Then she climbed back up, made coffee, and sat at the table in the thin winter light coming through the window. She wrapped both hands around the cup. She did not allow herself to celebrate. It was mid-December. The worst of winter had not arrived yet. She needed to see this hold before she told anyone, before she let herself believe it fully. But she sat there for a long time, longer than she usually permitted herself to sit without working, and she let herself feel the particular quiet satisfaction of a thing that has been thought through carefully and has done what it was supposed to do. The ground had not betrayed her. It had simply waited for her to ask the right question. Clara Holt was not a woman who spent time at windows. She had too much to do for that. There were animals to feed before her husband left for the workshop, bread to start before the kitchen warmed enough, to make proofing practical, child to dress and settle before the morning got away from her entirely. She was not a woman who watched the road. She was a woman who worked with her back to it. But something made her pause at the window that particular morning in late November, and what she saw stopped her in place with her hand still on the curtain. Sarah Whitmore was crossing from her cabin to the garden plot in the gray pre-dawn light, carrying a canvas sack. She moved without hurrying, without looking up, with the focused economy of someone doing a task they have done many times before. She reached the garden, emptied the sack, and spread whatever was in it with her boot across the frozen ground. Then she turned and went back inside. Clara watched this for a moment. Then she turned back to the kitchen. Her husband Jacob was at the table eating in the deliberate way he did everything, not fast, not slow, simply steady. "Mrs. Whitmore is up before first light again," Clara said. Jacob did not look up from his plate. "She's doing something foolish under that cabin." Clara filled her own cup and sat down across from him. She looked at her husband, at the particular set of his jaw that she recognized as the expression of a man who has made up his mind and does not want the matter revisited. "You've seen her work every morning for 2 weeks," Clara said. "I've seen a woman digging a hole under a load-bearing floor without the training to know what she might bring down on herself." "Maybe," Clara said, "or maybe she's thought of something you haven't." Jacob looked up then. Clara was already looking out the window again, her expression neutral, giving him nothing to argue against. He finished his breakfast and did not reply. But he set his cup down more carefully than usual, and he did not go straight to the workshop when he left the house. He stood in the road for a moment looking at Sarah's cabin before he walked on. The week that followed was the week the settlement's attention shifted towards Sarah Whitmore. in a way that could not be managed or redirected. Horace Finch had told 2 men at the store about the digging. Those men had told their wives. By the time Reverend Crawford heard about it, the story had acquired details that Sarah herself would not have recognized, including the suggestion that she was building some kind of storm cellar that was likely to flood in spring and take the children down with it. Crawford was a man who had lived long enough to know that rumors required correction before they calcified into community opinion. On a Tuesday morning in early December, he arrived at Sarah's door with Jacob Holt and Horace Finch behind him. Not as a tribunal, as a committee. In Crawford's mind, at least, there was a difference. Sarah opened the door and looked at all three of them. She stepped back and held the door open. They came in and she set water to heat without being asked, because whatever this conversation was going to be, it would go better with something warm in people's hands. Crawford sat down and folded his hands on the table, and to his genuine credit, he began the way he had promised himself he would begin, with a question rather than a conclusion. Sarah, I've heard a number of things about what you're doing. I haven't decided what I think. I'd like to hear it from you first. Horace opened his mouth. Crawford raised a hand without looking at him, and Horace closed it again. Sarah looked at Crawford for a moment and measured him. Then she told him. Not everything, not the full engineering of it, but the cold from below, the attempts that failed, the realization that the earth at depth held steady warmth, the room she was building to access it. She spoke plainly and without apology. She did not frame it as a request for permission, because she was not requesting permission. She was explaining a decision she had already made and was continuing to execute. When she finished, the room was quiet. Jacob spoke first. He said what he had been thinking since the morning on the road, the concern that had enough structural validity to deserve an answer. If the earth freezes and expands in late winter, it will push against the stone walls from outside. If the walls are not mortared, they can shift. The whole structure could fail by March. Riverstone, Sarah said. Dry stack, not mortared. When the earth expands, the stones shift slightly and resettle. Mortared walls crack and collapse. Unmortared walls flex. A pause. Jacob had no answer to that immediately, because it was correct, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize correctness when he heard it. Horace found a different angle. He spoke about the debt, about structural liability, about the precedent of a widow making alterations to a property that still had encumbrances against it, which was a way of saying several things at once, none of them quite the thing he actually meant, which was that a woman in Sarah's position should be dependent and was frightening him by refusing to be. The $14 is between you and me, Mr. Finch, Sarah said. It is not a matter for a committee. Horace sat back. Crawford looked at Sarah for a long moment after that exchange. He looked at her hands, which were calloused and scraped. He looked at the rug in the northwest corner of the room, which was slightly uneven, in a way that suggested something beneath it. He had been in enough homes, sat with enough people in enough difficult circumstances to know the difference between someone acting from panic and someone acting from a plan. I won't interfere, Sarah, he said, and he stood. But I want you to know that if I believe the children are in danger, I will act. That's fair, she said. The three men went. Sarah closed the door behind them and leaned against it. She stood there for a moment in the quiet of her own house. Then she became aware that she was not alone in the quiet. Emma was sitting in the chair by the window, a primer open on her lap that she had clearly not been reading. The girl looked up, and Sarah could see that she had been listening to every word of the conversation with the focused attention she always brought to things she considered important. You were awake, Sarah said. It was not an accusation. I wasn't asleep, Emma agreed. What did you think? Emma considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. I think Reverend Crawford is different from the other two. Why? Because he asked you first. Sarah looked at her daughter for a long moment. 8 years old, and she had seen the exact thing that mattered most clearly. Sarah thought about saying something about telling Emma that she was right, that asking first was the only thing that separated genuine concern from control, wearing the costume of concern. But Emma did not need to be told. She had already seen it. "Get your coat," Sarah said instead. "Help me carry the morning load." Emma closed the primer and went for her coat without another word. 2 days after Crawford's visit, Thomas Briggs walked into Sarah's cabin without knocking, which was a habit among the neighbors that had always been harmless and now was not. He came in looking for a hand drill he had lent Owen the previous summer and forgotten to retrieve. He stopped in the middle of the room. The trapdoor was open. The ladder was in place. From below, the sound of a spade working against compacted earth rose into the silence of the cabin. Thomas Briggs was 42, built wide across the shoulders, a man who understood physical work and respected competence when he saw it. He was not unintelligent. He was, however, a man of his time and his place, which meant that his understanding of what constituted appropriate competence for a woman had limits that he had never had any reason to examine because nothing had ever pushed against them before. He stood at the edge of the open trap door. "Margaret knows about this?" he asked. Sarah came up, the ladder soil on her hands and forearms. "She watches the children when I work mornings." Thomas's face changed, not to anger exactly, but to something tighter than concern. "She didn't tell me. I expect she made a judgment about what was necessary to tell. She's my wife." "She is," Sarah said. "She's also a grown woman who made a decision. I didn't ask her to keep it from you. That was her choice to make." Thomas looked at the open floor of the ladder descending into darkness. His expression was hard to read, and not because it was blank. It was hard to read because too many things were moving across it at once. He set the drill he had found near the door and left without taking it. That evening there was an argument in the Briggs cabin that Sarah could hear through the wall of her own, not the words, but the shape of it, the rise and fall of two voices with history between them negotiating something difficult. In the morning, Margaret appeared at Sarah's door. She did not have the bruised look of a woman who had been hit. She had the tired look of a woman who had been awake for most of the night. "Thomas says I should stop helping you," she said. Sarah opened the door wider. "Come in." Margaret came in and sat down. Sarah poured coffee and sat across from her. "Will you?" Sarah asked. Margaret looked at her cup. "Thomas is a good man. He's frightened of things he doesn't understand. Most men are, I think. They just have different ways of showing it." "I know. He's not wrong that I should have told him." "No," Sarah agreed. "He's not wrong about that." They sat in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. Outside, snow was beginning again. The fourth storm of the season, light and dry, dusting the porch, was something that looked like sugar. "He'll come around," Margaret said finally, "when he sees what you've built." "If it works," Sarah said. Margaret looked up. "Does it work?" Sarah thought about the thermometer reading from 2 weeks ago. 53 degrees in the chamber, when the cabin above could barely hold 50 near the fire. "Yes," she said, "it works." Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup. "Then he'll come around." The completion of the room happened quietly in the pre-dawn hours of the 17th of December, when Sarah drove the final wedge stones into the upper course of the eastern wall and climbed the ladder to stand in the cabin above and press her foot against the trap door from above and below twice to confirm the fit. Flush, invisible under the rug. She had been digging for 23 days. On the 18th, the temperature dropped hard. Not the worst it would be, but enough. 14 degrees by late afternoon. The fire in the cabin worked well, and the room above held around 50 degrees near the hearth and something lower than that near the floor. After dinner, Sarah put her hand on Daniel's forehead, not to check for fever, but simply to feel. His skin was the normal cool of a child who spent his day in a not quite warm enough house. He was eating well enough. The cough came twice during dinner and then stopped. She made her decision without announcing it. She brought blankets to the corner and folded back the rug. Emma watched from the table. "Come see what I've built," Sarah said. She did not perform any drama about it. She simply held the lamp over the opening and waited. Daniel came first the way he usually came to new things, without hesitation and without much analysis, driven by straightforward curiosity. He put his foot on the first rung of the ladder and climbed down. He reached the bottom and put his hand against the stone wall. He looked up at his mother with an expression that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. "Mama," he said, "the rocks aren't cold." Emma stood at the edge above, looking down. She had said it was dark. Sarah had told her it was warm. Emma weighed these against each other in the way she weighed everything, carefully and without rushing, and then she put her foot on the first rung. When all three of them were below and Sarah had the lamp settled on its shelf and the trapdoor was closed above them, the change was so immediate and so complete that for a moment none of them spoke. No wind, no flex in the walls from gusts pressing against the cabin, no sound of planks adjusting under temperature differential. The silence down here was the same silence Sarah had noticed during construction, thick and old. The silence of a place that did not change because the world's changes did not reach it. Daniel stopped fidgeting. He was a child who was always moving some part of himself, tapping a foot, turning something over in his hands, chewing the inside of his lip in a way that Sarah had given up trying to discourage. He stopped all of it. He sat on the sleeping platform and looked around the room with calm, unhurried eyes. And within 20 minutes, his head was listing to one side and his breathing had gone deep and even. It was the first time in 6 weeks that the coughing did not come. Emma lay beside him on her back, looking up at the earthen ceiling. After a while, she said quietly enough that Sarah almost did not hear it, "Do you think Papa knows we're here?" Sarah did not answer immediately. She thought about Owen, not the grief of him, but the specific fact of him. The way he had talked about earth and stone and things that held steady when everything else moved. He had said once that the ground beneath your feet was the only thing that never lied to you. "I think he might," Sarah said. Emma turned her head and looked at her mother. Then she closed her eyes. The thermometer read 53 degrees. Outside, by the time morning came, the temperature had dropped to 22 below. The storm arrived on the 11th of January. It came from the northwest the way the worst ones did, and it announced itself the night before with a particular quality of silence that people who had lived through Montana winters learned to recognize. The air went very still. The temperature dropped sharply before midnight. The sky cleared completely, showing stars with an abnormal brightness, and then by 3 in the morning the stars were gone and the first wall of wind hit the settlement like something that had been held back and then released all at once. By noon the snow was horizontal. By nightfall visibility was nothing. The temperature by Sarah's small outdoor thermometer, which she checked from the doorway without stepping outside, read 23 below. The wind made it feel like something the thermometer had no number for. The first 3 days, Sarah kept the children above ground. She banked the fire carefully, rationing the wood with the precision she had practiced for weeks, keeping the cabin around 48 degrees near the fire and lower than that everywhere else. She went down each morning to check the underground room to confirm it was holding, to read the thermometer. It held steady at 53, then 55, as the stone walls gradually absorbed and returned the ambient warmth that had been accumulating since December. She brought the children down at night to sleep and returned them above during the day. This kept the wood consumption minimal. The fire only had to manage the cabin during waking hours. At night, the cabin could cool to whatever it cooled to. On the 4th day, the woodpile situation changed. Not because she had misjudged, she had not, but the cold that 4th day reached a depth she had not fully planned for. The wind shifted and drove directly against the north wall and found the gaps she had not completely sealed, and the cabin interior dropped to 38 degrees by early afternoon, with the fire burning as much wood as she was willing to spend. 38 degrees was cold enough to be dangerous for a 5-year-old with a respiratory weakness. She could feel it in Daniel's chest when he pressed against her, the slight irregularity of his breathing that appeared when the air dropped below a certain point. She made the call. She banked the fire to its minimum, just enough to keep the chimney from going completely cold and filling the room with backdraft smoke if she relit it. She gathered every blanket they owned. She took the lamp. "Come with me," she said to the children. Daniel went down the ladder with the quick confidence he had developed over 3 weeks of nightly descents. Emma followed. When Sarah pulled the trap door closed above them, the sound of the storm simply stopped. Not diminished. Stopped. Daniel looked up at the closed door and then at his mother. "I can't hear it anymore." "No," Sarah said. She hung the lamp. She arranged the blankets. She checked the thermometer on the shelf. 55 degrees. She sat down on the sleeping platform with a child on each side of her, and she listened to the silence, and she let herself feel the particular quality of safety that comes not from comfort, but from sufficiency. This was enough. It was not luxury. It was enough, and enough was all she had ever asked for. They were there on the 6th day when the knock came. She heard it faintly through the trap door. 3 hard impacts against the cabin door above, irregular in rhythm, the kind of knocking that doesn't come from a hand making a social call. She climbed the ladder, pushed open the trap door, felt the cold of the empty cabin hit her immediately, the fire nearly out. The room dropped to something well below freezing. She crossed to the door and opened it. A child was standing in the snow. He was 7 years old. She knew him because she knew everyone in the settlement. Billy Croft from the family, 200 feet to the east. He was wearing a wool shirt and trousers but no coat. His lips were the color of a bruise. He was shaking with the deep, uncontrolled shuddering of a body that has lost the argument with cold and is losing more of it every moment. His eyes were open, but he was not entirely present in them. He had been sent to the woodshed for an armload and had come out into the whiteout and walked in the wrong direction and kept walking, because in a complete whiteout there is no right direction visible, and he had walked until he saw the faint difference in the darkness ahead of him. That was the shape of Sarah's cabin. She pulled him inside, closed the door. She did not put him near the coals of the dying fire. She knew enough about cold injury to know that sudden external heat applied to a severely chilled body could cause more harm than help. What he needed was stable warmth given gradually surrounding his core. She opened the trap door. "Emma," she called down. "Move to the side. I'm bringing someone." She lifted Billy Croft, who was small for 7 and lighter than she expected, and carried him down the ladder one-handed, with a grip she would not have believed herself capable of before this winter. She laid him on the sleeping platform between Emma and Daniel, who looked at the shaking boy with wide eyes, and without being asked, moved close to him on either side, their body heat adding to his. Sarah pulled every blanket over all 3 children. The temperature in the room was 55 degrees. Still, no draft, no wind chill factor in any amount, because there was no air movement at all. The cold could not reach them here, the way cold requires movement to reach flowing and finding and stripping. Down here, the cold was simply absent. Within 2 hours, the shaking had stopped. Within 4, Billy Croft was able to answer a direct question with a coherent sentence. Within 6, he was asleep. Sarah sat in the corner of the underground room with her back against the stone wall and looked at the 3 children sleeping in the lamplight. Daniel on the right, Emma on the left. Billy Croft between them, a boy she barely knew alive because he had walked in the wrong direction. She thought about what would have happened if she had taken Crawford's offer, if she had spent the winter in the church. The cabin would have been empty. Billy would have knocked on a locked door. She thought about the $14 in Horace Finch's ledger. She thought about Jacob Holt's concern about the east wall. She thought about Thomas Briggs' voice rising through the shared wall of their cabins. And then she stopped thinking about any of it because there was nothing to think about anymore. Three children were sleeping safely in a room she had built with her hands over 23 days, and outside the worst storm in 40 years was doing everything cold could do to the world above them, and none of it was reaching these three. She did not cry right away. She sat with it for a while first. When she did, it was quietly in the way she did most things, without performance, without sound. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and let it come and let it go. And when it was done, she wiped her face and checked the thermometer and adjusted the lamp wick and settled back against the wall. The thermometer read 57 degrees. The storm went on for 8 days. Sarah climbed above twice each day to tend what remained of the fire, to check the exterior temperature, to bring down what food she could carry. Cold cornbread, dried apples, water she melted from snow in a pot set close to the embers. Each time she went up, the cold of the emptying cabin shocked her with its completeness, a cold that had all the weight of outdoors, because that was essentially what the cabin had become. Each time she came back down and pulled the trap door closed, the warmth of the room settled around her like something with texture. She went up on the morning of the fourth day and looked out the cabin window at the settlement. She saw things she would not describe to the children. She saw the smoke from the Holt chimney that was too dark and too thin, which meant they were burning something they should not be burning because their wood was gone. She saw the Finch cabin with no smoke at all for most of the morning, which either meant they had solved the problem or had given up on trying. She saw two figures in the far distance moving through chest-deep snow toward the church, carrying a bundle between them, moving with the particular desperation of people who have exhausted their other choices. She went back down. On the fifth day, Billy Croft had recovered enough to be restless, which meant he was well enough to be himself again. He and Daniel occupied the sleeping platform with a quiet game that appeared to involve arranging pebbles from the floor into patterns with rules that they periodically renegotiated. Emma read by lamplight and occasionally arbitrated their disputes with the weary authority of someone several years older than either of them. Sarah watched them and thought about the east wall she had rebuilt after the collapse. She thought about the timber ledger she had added at her father's memories instruction. She pressed her palm against the stone and felt it hold steady, not cold, not warm, simply constant, the way her father had promised the earth would be if you went deep enough to ask it properly. On the ninth morning, the wind simply stopped, not gradually. It stopped the way it had started between one moment and the next, and the silence that followed was so complete and so sudden that Sarah, sleeping lightly on her folded coat in the corner, woke immediately and lay still for a moment, trying to identify what had changed. Nothing was making noise. That was what had changed. She climbed the ladder. The cabin above was cold, but still no more air pushing through the gaps. Through the window, thin winter sunlight was hitting snow that had drifted to the sill on the north side and piled to the roof on the east. The sky was pale and clear and absolutely empty. She rebuilt the fire from the embers she had nursed through the storm. While it was catching, she looked at the woodpile, more than she had expected, substantially more. She had been counting sticks for days, rationing with a precision she had learned from weeks of practice, and even so she was surprised by how much remained. The underground room had not needed heating. The children's body heat and the stable temperature of the earth had done what the fire would otherwise have spent itself doing. All those nights below ground were nights the woodpile had not been touched. She stood looking at what remained of the supply and did the arithmetic she had been afraid to do during the storm. She had burned less than half a cord through the entire event. She was still standing there with this number in her head when someone knocked on the door. Margaret Briggs stood in the snow with a pot of something she had clearly made, with the last of whatever she had left in her own stores, her face carrying the particular expression of a person who had prepared themselves to find something bad and was not yet ready to recalibrate. Sarah held the door open. Margaret stepped inside, looked at the fire burning steadily, looked at the room, looked at Sarah. Then she looked at the trap door in the corner, which was open, and at the ladder descending into warmth and lamplight, and at the three children climbing up it one by one into the morning. She looked at Billy Croft. Margaret had known the Croft family for 11 years. She had been at the birth of every one of their children. She looked at Billy Croft, 7 years old, alive, and apparently comfortable climbing out of a hole in Sarah Whitmore's floor. She set the pot down on the table. She sat down on the floor, not in a chair, on the floor, as if her legs had simply finished with the conversation and made the decision for her. Sarah sat down beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Margaret asked the question she had been turning over in her mind since she left her own cabin and saw the thin smoke from Sarah's chimney, far too thin for 8 days of storm. "How much wood did you use?" "Less than half a cord," Sarah said. Margaret closed her eyes. Her husband's 2 fingers were wrapped in cloth and had no feeling in them. Her neighbor's youngest child had been carried to the church in a blanket. The Holts had burned furniture. Horace Finch had burned his fence posts on day 6, and his 3-year-old daughter was coughing in a way that did not sound like the ordinary winter kind. Less than half a cord. Margaret sat on the floor of Sarah's cabin with her eyes closed and said nothing for a long time. Outside, for the first time in 9 days, it was quiet. And in the corner of the room, the trap door stood open, and below it, the lamp still burned in the room that Sarah had built, steady and unhurried in the earth, that had never changed temperature once through the entirety of the worst winter in 40 years. The settlement dug itself out slowly over 2 days. People moved in the particular way that survivors move, not with urgency anymore, but with the careful attention of those who have just learned that they are still alive and want to remain that way. They cleared paths between cabins. They checked on neighbors. They counted livestock and discovered which animals had made it and which had not. They inventoried their wood supplies and found almost universally that the inventories were worse than expected. Then they began to notice things. The first was Sarah's chimney. During the storm, anyone who had looked in that direction at any point during those 8 days would have seen smoke so thin it barely colored the air above her roof. Other chimneys had belched dark, heavy clouds as families burned green wood and furniture and fence posts. Sarah's had produced the pale wisp of a carefully rationed, well-seasoned burn. No one had thought about it during the storm, because during the storm everyone was occupied with staying alive. But now, in the stillness afterward, the memory of that thin smoke became a question that people could not quite put down. The second thing they noticed was Billy Croft. His parents had spent 2 days believing their son was dead. The storm had erased his tracks within minutes of his leaving the woodshed, and by the time his father had fought his way to the shed and back without finding the boy, the cold had passed the point where a 7-year-old without a coat could have been expected to survive. His mother had stopped speaking on the second day. His father had gone through the motions of storm survival with the mechanical efficiency of a man whose interior had gone dark. When the wind stopped and they dug out and the counting began, Billy Croft's name was on the list of losses that nobody said aloud, but everyone understood. Until Sarah Whitmore walked through knee-deep snow to the Croft cabin with a 7-year-old boy holding her hand. The door opened. Billy's mother looked at her son and did not speak. She simply dropped to her knees in the doorway and pulled the boy against her, and the sound she made was not a word in any language, but it carried more meaning than any word Sarah had ever heard. Billy's father came to the door behind his wife. He was a tall man who did not show emotion easily, and he did not show it now, not in a way that most people would have recognized. He simply stood and looked at his son and at Sarah and at the space between the two of them, And then he put his hand on the door frame and gripped it, and Sarah saw his knuckles go white. When he could speak, he asked one question. How did you keep him warm? Sarah told him. She did not explain the science. She did not offer the history. She said, I brought him below ground. Mr. Croft looked at her. Can you show me how, he said. Sarah had heard many questions over the past month about what she was doing. Some were challenges, some were warnings, some were expressions of concern that carried other things inside them. Things about what a woman should and should not attempt. This was the first question that contained none of those things. It was a question from a man who had spent 2 days grieving a child who was alive and who wanted to know only one thing: how to make sure it never happened again. Yes, she said, come by when you're ready. She walked home through the snow. Behind her, Billy Croft's mother had not let go of her son and would not for several hours. Emma was waiting at the window when Sarah returned. She had been watching from the moment her mother left with Billy, and she had seen the Croft cabin door open, and she had seen what happened there even from a distance. Billy's mama cried, Emma said. Yes, Sarah said, because she thought he was gone. Yes, Emma thought about this. If we didn't have the room, Billy would be gone. Sarah sat down and looked at her daughter. She did not want to burden an 8-year-old with the full weight of that sentence, but she also did not want to lie to her. Yes, she said, he would. Emma nodded once slowly, the way she did when she was storing something away inside herself, and went back to the book she had been reading. 3 days after the storm broke, Jacob Holt came. He did not bring tools or questions or opinions. He came to Sarah's door, carrying nothing, wearing the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for several days and has finally decided to put it down. Sarah opened the door. They stood and looked at each other. I burned Clara's wedding chairs, Jacob said. The set her parents gave us when we married. I broke them apart with a hammer and fed them into the stove piece by piece while Clara held the baby and watched. Sarah said nothing. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't have to. I knew what I was doing. I was burning something that couldn't be replaced to buy another 4 hours of heat that was never going to be enough. He looked past her into the cabin toward the corner where the rug lay flat and unremarkable over the trapdoor. I told you that what you were doing was dangerous. I came to your home with 2 other men to tell you to stop. And while you kept 3 children alive in a room you built with your own hands, I was smashing my wife's wedding furniture with a hammer. Mr. Holt, Sarah began. I was wrong, Jacob said, and I want you to know that I know it. Sarah looked at the carpenter standing in her doorway. His hands were at his sides, the hands of a man who built things for a living, rough and capable, hanging, now with a heaviness that had nothing to do with fatigue. She could have accepted his apology simply and let him go. She could have been gracious about it in the way that people expect women to be gracious, smooth and forgiving and quick to reassure. She chose not to do that. You were not wrong about the risk, she said. There was a night when the east wall came in and I was trapped below in the dark for 20 minutes. The danger you were concerned about was real. Jacob looked up sharply. But I was measuring the wrong risk too at first. I was measuring the risk of trying against the risk of failing. What I should have been measuring was the risk of trying against the certainty of doing nothing. Doing nothing was not safe. Doing nothing was guaranteed failure. Trying was only possible failure. When I understood the difference, the decision was easy. Jacob stood with that for a moment. Can I see it? He asked. Sarah opened the trap door. Jacob looked down into the space below, then lowered himself onto the ladder and descended. He stood in the underground room and did what any builder would do. He looked at the joinery of the stone walls. He examined the way the courses were stacked, the wedge stones that locked them in place, the gaps she had intentionally left for minor earth movement. He touched the timber ledger at the top of the wall that held back the earth above the stone line. He noted the ventilation and the drainage. He read the room the way a literate man reads a letter, seeing both what was written and what was implied. When he came back up, his face had changed, not to admiration exactly, to something more professional than that. He had seen what she had done correctly, and he had also seen what could be done better, and the combination of those two things had shifted something fundamental in how he saw her. If you run support posts from the floor of the chamber to the underside of the cabin floor above, he said, the whole structure gains lateral strength. The earth can push against the stone walls and the posts absorb the load. Your stonework is good, but it's carrying everything alone. Sarah looked at him. I thought about that. I didn't have the lumber. I have lumber, Jacob said, and I'm going to build one of these under my cabin, but better. There was no malice in the word better. He was a carpenter. Improving designs was what he did. Sarah heard it for what it was the first moment when her idea had become something larger than her alone, something that another mind was taking and extending and making its own. Good, she said. Jacob nodded, then he left, not to go home, to go to his workshop where Clara found him 3 hours later drawing plans on the back of a board measuring dimensions, calculating load tolerances, working with the focused intensity that she recognized as the expression of a man who had found something worth building. The next morning, it was not Jacob who came to Sarah's door. It was Clara. She came with cornbread because she was a woman who did not arrive anywhere empty-handed, and she came with a request that surprised Sarah. Jacob is going to build ours, Clara said, but I want to see yours first, not his drawings, yours. I want to understand it myself before I sleep in it. Sarah opened the trap door, and the two women went down together. Clara stood in the room and looked at everything. She touched the stone walls. She felt the air still and unmoving. She sat on the sleeping platform and put her palms flat against the wood and waited as if she was listening for something beneath the surface. Jacob described it like a cellar, Clara said after a while. But it's not that, is it? No, Sarah said, it's a place below the wind. Clara nodded, and Sarah saw in her expression something she had not expected. Not gratitude, recognition. Clara recognized this room as something that made sense, the kind of deep and obvious sense that only becomes visible after someone else has done the work of uncovering it, and the recognition carried with it the particular sting of a thing that should have been known all along. Thank you, Clara said, for not waiting for anyone's permission. 1 week after the storm, Nora Finch appeared at Sarah's door. Nora was 36, a quiet woman who occupied a particular position in the settlement as someone who was liked by everyone and noticed by almost no one, which was partly temperament and partly the consequence of being married to a man whose personality occupied all available space in any room they shared. She came alone without Horace, and she stood on the porch with the posture of someone who has had to build up courage for a considerable time before arriving. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, I know my husband has not been kind to you. Please come in, Sarah said. Nora came in. She sat at the table and folded her hands together in a way that was not relaxed. Our daughter is still sick. From the smoke, the doctor says her lungs need clean air and stable warmth. Our cabin has neither. We burned everything that would burn, and some of what we burned had paint on it, and the smoke from that is what made her ill. She looked at Sarah. Her eyes were steady, but her hands were not. Could you let us bring her here to the room below, just for a few nights, until her breathing clears? Sarah thought about Horace Finch. She thought about the ledger with her $14 debt written in his careful hand. She thought about the way he had looked at her at the general store and the way he had come to her home with Crawford and Jacob to suggest that she was a danger to her own children. She had every reason to say no. She was not obligated to help people who had not helped her. She was not required to open the room she had built with her own hands and her own risk to the family of a man who had tried to stop her from building it. But she was not looking at Horace Finch. She was looking at Nora Finch, a mother with a sick child, And that was a different equation entirely. Bring her tonight, Sarah said. Nora left. She returned at dusk with her daughter wrapped in blankets, and Sarah showed her the ladder and helped her down and settled the little girl on the sleeping platform. The child was small and pale, and her breathing had a wet, ragged quality that made Sarah's chest tighten in recognition. Daniel had sounded like that in October. They'd been below for an hour when the cabin door opened above and Horace Finch's voice came through the floorboards. Nora. Sarah climbed the ladder. Horace stood inside the cabin, his face flushed from the cold and from something else that she could see working behind his eyes, a complicated machinery of pride and shame and fear, turning against each other. Nora is downstairs with your daughter, Sarah said. She did not tell me she was coming here. She made a decision about what her daughter needed. Horace looked at the trap door in the floor. He looked at the rug pushed aside in the square of darkness below and the faint glow of lamplight coming up from underneath. He could hear his wife's voice down there murmuring something soft and steady to the child, the particular music of a mother's voice performing the ancient work of comfort. He stood in the cold cabin looking at the hole in the floor that he had warned Sarah about, that he had come with two other men to question, that represented everything he believed a woman alone should not attempt. I was wrong about you, Horace said. The words came out stiff as if they had cost him something significant to produce. That is not easy for me to say. I know, Sarah said. It doesn't need to be said again. Your daughter needs to be downstairs. Horace stood there for another moment. Then he took off his coat and folded it carefully over the back of a chair. He walked to the trap door and looked down. His wife looked up at him from below the child in her arms and waited. He went down the ladder. For 3 nights, the Finch family slept in the room Sarah had built. By the 3rd morning, the child's breathing had cleared enough that the wet sound was gone. Clean air, stable temperature, no smoke, no drafts. Horace brought back the child and the blankets and stood at Sarah's door when it was over. He did not say thank you in words. He set something on the table that Sarah did not look at until after he left. It was the page from his ledger with her account on it. The 14 Mauers. He had torn it out and written across the bottom in his careful handwriting, settled in full. The following Sunday, the settlement gathered in the church. It was the first full service since the storm, and the pews were filled in a way that had less to do with faith and more to do with the human need to sit in a warm room together after surviving something that had tried to kill them separately. Reverend Crawford preached about humility. He preached about the difference between what we think we know and what we actually know, and about the danger of confusing certainty with correctness. It was a good sermon in the way that his sermons were usually good, thoughtful, and measured, and carefully constructed. Then near the end, he departed from the text he had prepared. There is someone among us, he said, who did something I tried to prevent. I visited her home. I told her I would act if I believed her children were in danger. I said it with the confidence of a man who was certain he understood the situation. He paused. I did not understand the situation. Sarah Whitmore, would you stand? Sarah was seated in the middle section, Emma on her left, Daniel on her right. Daniel had his hand on her arm in the way he did when he was comfortable and wanted contact without conversation. Emma was sitting very straight, looking at Crawford with the evaluating attention that was her constant posture toward the adult world. Sarah looked at Crawford and took a moment to assess. Was this genuine? Was it performance? She had spent a lifetime reading the difference, and what she saw in the old minister's face was neither performance nor calculation. It was something she recognized because she had felt it herself. It was the expression of a person who had learned something important too late and was trying to make it count for something anyway. She stood. She kept 3 children alive through the worst storm this valley has seen in 40 years, Crawford said. Not by building higher walls or burning more wood, by going down, by trusting the ground beneath her when the rest of us were trusting fire and luck. That is a lesson I will carry for the rest of my life, and I owe her an apology for standing in its way. The room was quiet. Jacob Holt in the front pew turned and looked at Sarah and gave a single firm nod. Clara beside him did the same. Thomas Briggs, his right hand still wrapped in cloth, looked at his wife. Margaret did not nod. She smiled. A small, private smile that contained the quiet vindication of a woman who had known something was right before the evidence arrived and had chosen to act on that knowledge without waiting for permission. Horace Finch sat still, looking forward. His face showed nothing in particular, but his small notebook, the one he carried everywhere and consulted constantly, the one he used to record observations and debts and judgments, remained in his pocket. He did not reach for it. And Emma Whitmore, 8 years old, sitting beside her mother in the wooden pew of a church in Montana in January of 1888, looked up at Sarah standing and saw something she had been watching form for months without having a word for it. She saw her mother, not the way a child sees a mother as the source of food and warmth and safety and correction. She saw Sarah Whitmore as a person, a complete, specific person who had been afraid and had acted anyway, who had been alone and had built something, who had been doubted by everyone with authority and had trusted herself when trust was the only material she had in sufficient supply. Emma did not know, sitting in that pew, that 20 years later, she would build a similar room beneath her own homestead in Idaho. She did not know that she would marry a man who would pick up a shovel and help her dig without asking why, because by then she would have become the kind of woman whose judgment did not require external validation. She did not know any of that yet. What she knew in that moment was that she was looking at the person she wanted to become, and she was memorizing everything. Sarah felt her daughter's eyes on her and looked down. Emma did not speak. She just looked. And Sarah understood without it being said that whatever happened next, the thing she had built, had already been passed on. It was already living in someone else's mind. It was already becoming someone else's future. She sat back down. The service ended. People filed out into the cold January sunlight and spoke to each other with the tentative warmth of neighbors who had remembered during the storm that they needed each other. What happened next happened quickly by frontier standards. By late January, Jacob Holt had completed his underground chamber. He had followed Sarah's design in its essentials and improved it in its engineering, adding the timber support posts he had described and deepening the stone walls by an additional 6 inches. When Clara slept there for the first time, she wept, not from sadness, from the relief of a woman who had spent 8 nights wondering if her family would survive and was now lying in a room where that question simply did not apply. Margaret Briggs could not dig directly beneath her cabin because the foundation sat too shallow on the rocky soil. Instead, she convinced Thomas to help her build a room against the north exterior wall, sunk 3 feet into the earth, with stone sides and a timber roof covered in packed soil. Thomas dug without enthusiasm at first, then with increasing focus as the logic of the project became apparent in his hands. The work changed something between them, not everything. Margaret did not expect everything to change. But when Thomas stood in the finished room and put his bandaged hand against the stone wall and felt the steadiness of it, something in his face shifted that Margaret recognized as the beginning of understanding. Not understanding of the engineering, understanding of his wife. Mr. Croft built the simplest version, a sleeping space barely large enough for his family lined with rough timber instead of stone, because the ground on his property was too rocky for deep stacking. It worked imperfectly, holding warmth less evenly than Sarah's original design. But it held enough. That winter, his family slept warm for the first time in the 3 years they had lived at Bitterroot Creek. By the following winter, 7 families had some version of the room. Each one was different. Each one carried the fingerprints of the people who built it, their particular soil and stone, their particular carpentry skills, or lack thereof, their particular understanding of what mattered most. But the principle was the same in everyone. Let the earth do the work it was already doing. Go below where the wind cannot follow. The numbers were difficult to argue with. The 7 families with underground sleeping chambers used on average less than half the firewood of the families without them. No children in those 7 households developed the serious respiratory illnesses that came from sleeping in smoke-filled, overheated, inadequately ventilated cabins. The difference showed in the quality of the winter itself, in the way those families moved through the cold months. They were calmer, less desperate. Storms still came and snow still buried the valley, but fear no longer defined every cold night. In the spring of 1889, a man named William Archer passed through the settlement on his way to homestead land in Wyoming. He noticed the trap door in Sarah's floor and asked about it. Sarah explained in 10 minutes what had taken her 3 weeks to build and a lifetime of her father's teaching to understand. Archer listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked a single question. "Is this your idea or someone else's?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "The earth has been doing this for longer than anyone has been building on top of it. I just paid attention to what was already there." Archer wrote in a small journal and moved on. Within 2 years, variations of the underground sleeping chamber appeared in parts of Wyoming and the Dakotas, carried by word of mouth and practical demonstration, spreading the way useful things spread in communities where survival is not theoretical. Sarah Whitmore remarried in 1894. Her new husband, a quiet man from Missoula, slept in the underground room the first winter without complaint. He said it was warmer than the house he had grown up in, which had been larger and better built than Sarah's cabin by every conventional standard. Daniel Whitmore grew up and became a stonemason. He worked in Missoula building foundations and public structures, and in every design he incorporated the principle he had learned by sleeping 6 feet below his mother's floor. He never called it an invention. When a young architect once asked him where he had learned earth-sheltered design, Daniel stopped working and thought about it for a moment. "From my mother," he said. "She dug it by hand in the dark." He went back to work. On the first day of spring in 1888, the snow began to melt. Water ran in thin streams down the paths between cabins, and the frozen earth softened at the edges, and the sky was the particular blue that comes only after a winter that has tested everything beneath it. Sarah opened the cabin door that morning and stepped outside and felt the ground give slightly under her boot. Soft earth, warming soil, the beginning of the long thaw that would take Montana from white to green over the course of 2 months. She went back inside and walked to the corner of the room and folded the rug aside and opened the trap door. Sunlight had found its way through the ventilation pipe and cast a single thin line of gold across the dark stone below. She stood there looking down into the room she had built, the sleeping platform where 3 children had slept through the worst storm in 40 years. The stone walls she had stacked one by one with hands that blistered and then hardened and then forgot they had ever been soft. The shelf where the lamp had burned through 8 days of darkness, while the world above tried its best to freeze everything alive. She stood there and thought about Owen, not with grief, with something closer to conversation. She thought about what he had said about the earth and about trust and about the things beneath your feet that never change. She thought about whether he would have understood what she had done, and she knew immediately that he would have, because it was exactly the kind of answer he would have looked for himself. Patient, quiet, already there waiting to be found. Emma came and stood beside her. She looked down into the room the way her mother was looking, with an expression that contained both memory and something forward-looking, something that reached toward a future neither of them could see yet. "Are we going to close it up?" Emma asked. No, we'll need it again next winter. And the winter after that, and the one after that. Emma stood beside her mother for another moment. Then she asked the question that Sarah would remember longer than any other question anyone had ever asked her. When I'm grown and I have my own house, will I dig one too? Sarah looked at her daughter. She looked at the girl who had sat beside a dark hole holding an unlit candle waiting. The girl who had listened to three men tell her mother to stop and had noticed which one asked first. The girl who had lain awake at night watching her mother work and had never once asked her to explain or to justify or to prove. You'll dig, Sarah said, and you'll do it better than I did. Emma nodded. It was the nod of someone who had already made the decision and was simply hearing it confirmed. They stood together at the edge of the opening and looked down into the quiet room below. The thin line of spring sunlight had moved slightly across the stone floor as the earth continued its slow turn. Above them, water dripped from the eaves. Outside, the settlement was waking into a new season, changed in ways that most of its residents were only beginning to understand. Sarah Whitmore never named what she had done. She never wrote about it or spoke about it publicly or claimed credit for the rooms that other families built using her design. She answered questions when people asked. She showed her work when invited. She explained simply and moved on. She had not set out to change how a community understood shelter. She had set out to keep her children warm through a winter that was trying to kill them. Everything else that followed the seven families, the designs that spread to Wyoming and the Dakotas, the stonemason's son who carried the principle into buildings that would outlast everyone who remembered its origin, all of it grew from a single night when a woman sat beside a dying fire and decided that she had not yet tried everything. There was still the ground. There was still the quiet, steady warmth of the earth beneath the floor, patient and unchanged, waiting for someone to go deep enough to find it. She found it. And the cold she had feared more than anything. The cold that had threatened to take her children from her in the silence of a Montana night became the very thing that proved she was right. Because it was only when the cold showed its worst that the earth showed what it had always been offering. A place below the wind, where nothing changed, where the ground held steady, where three children slept through a storm that broke the world above them and woke in the morning warm.